Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is January 25th, 2011, and my guest is investigative journalist Brian Deer. Brian has spent 7 years or so investigating claims that vaccination causes autism among children, particularly looking at an influential 1998 study that made that claim. In a recent set of reports, he has shown that those claims were not just inaccurate, but fraudulent and corrupt. Brian, welcome to EconTalk.
Hi, Russ.
So in 1998, Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious medical journal in the world, published a study claiming a link between vaccination and both autism and bowel disease. Tell us what that original study claimed and what its the basis for those claims were.
Well, as you say, it was published in The Lancet, which is a British-based medical journal, comes out weekly. It's reckoned to be secondary to the two most prestigious journals, which would be the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association, but nevertheless, immensely influential journal. And in February 1998, February 28th edition of 1998, it published a 5-page paper by a team of doctors at a North London medical school. They were led by a Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who was at the time he was a former trainee surgeon. He never finished training as a surgeon, but had moved into laboratory research. And with 12 other doctors, including pediatricians and pathologists, he published a paper claiming that, if I give the scenario, that 12 families had turned up at the hospital associated with this medical school, the Royal Free, which is in Hampstead in North London. They had turned up between July 1996 and February 1997. And the children they brought with them were children with various kinds of developmental disorders, mostly described in the paper as regressive autism. And regressive autism is a kind of autism where children appear to be making normal progress and then suddenly start to go backwards. They lose language and they lose skills. And this can occur usually in the sort of second year of life. One sees this. And he said that in 8 of the cases, the parents had said to the doctors words to the effect of, "It was the MMR doctor. Our child had been developing normally and then was given the MMR vaccine, the vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella, and within just 14 days, just 2 weeks, started to show the first signs of autism." And these children were then admitted to the hospital for a battery of tests, including colonoscopies as far as the small intestine, which means inserting a tube all the way around the large bowel into the small bowel. They had lumbar punctures, they were put through brain scanners, they drank radioactive drinks, a whole battery of tests that lasted 5 days they were admitted for. And Dr. Wakefield claimed in this paper that he'd found in them inflammatory bowel disease. So we had these three things. We had children with regressive autism, they had inflammatory bowel disease, and the parents were saying that the first signs of the autism came on within just days, just 14 days of vaccination. And the authors of the paper then went on to adopt those claims to propose that they had discovered what they called a new syndrome of bowel disease and autism associated with the 3-in-1 vaccine. That, in a nutshell, is what was published way back in 1998.
Now, they did not suggest any causal connection other than just this correlation. There seemed to be these 12 families presented. 8 of them had very recently from the onset of symptoms, at least so it was claimed. It had this vaccine, but they didn't make any claims about the underlying pathology or how it might work.
Well, it's not quite true. They didn't make claims of causality. They did actually make...
They didn't have a medical mechanism that they proposed for how this came about, did they?
Not in that paper, no. But Wakefield, in fact, did produce another paper, which he submitted to the Lancet at the same time, where he did propose that mechanism, but that paper was rejected. Originally, the two papers were supposed to be published together in his mind, at least, but the peer reviewers rejected the second paper in which he did propose a causal mechanism.
And what was that mechanism?
It was the measles virus. His idea was that measles virus, which is live as a normal part of the MMR vaccine, had infected the children's guts and persisted in their guts. And it was this which had caused the gut damage, and the gut damage went on to cause the brain damage. But that was rejected by the Lancet.
But this was a paper that had 12 data points. You could argue 8, I guess. It's a small number. There are hundreds of thousands of children who get the MMR vaccine. Was there any other evidence among folks that there was an onset of symptoms shortly after the vaccine?
Well, no. In fact, other people who studied this very soon after found that there was no such link. And in fact, that link was very quickly abandoned. It appeared in this paper, and then Dr. Wakefield very quickly abandoned the suggestion that there was a problem coming on within days.
So the paper was published. And again, I'm sort of wondering why it was. Maybe we'll come back to that. But they published the paper, and it made quite a splash, I assume.
It did. It made the evening news on all networks, although going back to 1998, we didn't have as many networks as we have now. But it made all networks, and most of the national media covered it the next day. Because the medical school, the Royal Free Medical School in Hampstead, they announced this paper with a press conference to which they invited all the media, a televised press conference, and they actually distributed, the most extraordinary thing, they actually distributed a 23-minute video news release in which Wakefield appeared calling for the MMR vaccine to be suspended and giving broadcasters essentially a package. It was essentially a kit given to media by which they could create media products highlighting this allegation that was being made. So they put a very great deal of work into this. They also installed extra telephone lines into the hospital, and they really were ready to push this on the British public.
That's because they cared about the children, of course. As we'll see, that turns out not to perhaps be so true. But it made a splash in the media. It also generated a large set of additional work trying to look at the relationship between vaccination and autism, correct? And what did that work find?
Oh, well, very quickly, because, this was a matter, obviously, of great public interest. If one just takes the thing at face value, many initial medical observations occur in individual patients. That would be expected. Here we had a suggestion that this was possibly a snapshot, if you like, of what could potentially be a hidden epidemic of catastrophic injuries to children. Because if this picture was being replicated at hospitals all over the world, that there were these injuries occurring within such a short time of MMR, then that would be an issue of great public concern. So not only was there the media response, there was also a response by government, where the British government, through the British Department of Health, immediately commissioned studies. Studies were commissioned in other countries, other governments. The US federal government commissioned studies. Independent academic institutions began studying this question. And they looked at, they did big number crunching to try and see whether there had been an increase in the number of cases of autism that corresponded with the increase in vaccination levels. They looked to see whether there was any new bowel disease in autistic children that hadn't been noticed before. They looked at it in all kinds of different ways, and every single study that anybody ever did on this subject found not only no support for Wakefield's claims, but clearly rebutted them.
And this was all being done against a background where there was an apparent increase in the incidence of autism. And so people were very eager to find possible correlates and ideally causal agents. And this was a possible one. There'd been an increase in vaccination rates around the world. So I think it appealed to people in a sort of back-of-the-envelope way. But as you say, there wasn't any confirming evidence other than this one study. Were there any studies done outside of the UK, in America?
Yes, there were studies done in Denmark, studies run out of the United States, studies, all kinds of different groups of people. Medical science is very internationalized. So when one thing occurs in one country, you'll find people with similar interests will start studying the same thing in other countries, and everybody drew a blank. So they were kind of confronted with this situation. As the years went by, more and more studies accumulated, different pieces of research accumulated, which showed no association. And yet there was Wakefield's work, and it wasn't only this particular paper, although this is the most important. He also did subsequent publications, which also worked very much along the same lines, which I wouldn't bore your listeners with going into, because one can, get exhausted with going into these individual studies.
But he continued to be a spokesperson for this theory, and obviously he alarmed an enormous number of parents.
Yes.
There's, if you search the internet is full of anxiety about autism and vaccination, correct?
That's right.
Isn't here in America, the standard worry is the preservative that is used in vaccinations, which I think has mercury in it. And there was
thimerosal, which has now really been removed from children's vaccines. That's right.
So, but that has nothing to do with the Wakefield story.
Well, it sort of does, in the sense that I don't want to sort of jump too far ahead of the tale, but it sort of does have a relationship. Although the MMR vaccine has never contained thimerosal, because it's a live vaccine. The three components are live vaccines, and thimerosal is a preservative that would kill the effective components in the vaccine. So MMR has never included that component.
Which vaccines do include it?
Mostly it's been the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine.
Okay.
Also, the flu vaccine. Some flu vaccines still, in fact, contain thimerosal, but most don't. So, but mostly where the thimerosal was being used was in the older vaccines against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis.
So let's go back to MMR though. So we've got an accumulating body of evidence that there doesn't seem to be a relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism or bowel disease. We have Wakefield continuing to make claims that it is, based on his original paper and then some subsequent ones. How did you get involved? Where do you come in?
Well, when his original paper was published, I was in fact looking at the controversy over the earlier vaccine, the DTP vaccine, because there had been a great medical controversy over that, which had led in the United States particularly to the drug industry basically saying, well, we're not going to produce vaccines anymore because we're being sued so much. There was an epidemic of lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers in the 1980s following a program that was broadcast on CBS, the CBS network, called Vaccine Roulette, which also incidentally came out of the UK. The concerns over that vaccine came out of the UK. And I just happened to be looking at that other vaccine at the same time that Wakefield's study was published in 1998, purely by chance. And I looked at his paper and I thought, well, there's something very odd about this paper. There's something that doesn't sit right, just reading it on the page. And that was really based on my study of this other vaccine. But I said at the time, I'm absolutely not getting involved in MMR. And the reason I wasn't going to get involved in MMR is that journalistically, investigations into vaccines, if you want to do them in a responsible way, rather than simply go to government experts or go to parents or go to various people with interests and just write down what they say or present the different clash of opinions, if you want to understand what the story is really about, they require an enormous amount of work, because vaccine issues are so multidisciplinary. They can involve epidemiology, big number crunching of statistics. It can involve, well, in the MMR case, it involves gastroenterology, virology, developmental pediatrics. And there's all these different areas which, if you really want to understand and know what you're talking about, you have to get on top of. And I said at the time, I absolutely am not going to get involved in another vaccine story, because professionally, if you're a journalist, you don't want to get too associated with one thing, or you become like the office expert, they say. In fact, the Sunday Times people were saying, oh, well, MMR, Brian Deer, he's our expert on vaccines, based on what I'd done on DTP. So I said I was not going to get involved. But then in late 2003, one of the editors of the paper was changing jobs within the paper, and he was taking over some feature pages. So he wanted stories that would fill feature pages. And he said to me, well, can't you do me an investigation? And I said, well, what? And he came up with 3 or 4 different ideas. And one of them was MMR. And I said, well, I don't really want to get involved in MMR because there's a lawsuit coming up, and I've been involved in vaccines before. And then, just by serendipity, the lawsuit was cancelled, and he just said, "Oh, well, just do us a feature for." I think I was supposed to spend about 2 weeks, maybe possibly on the outside 3 weeks on MMR. Coinciding with
the best laid plans of mice and men gang after Glade. So it ended up being a little more than 3 weeks.
Well, it ended up 3 weeks turned into 7 years. Although I have to say, not the whole time. I did make a couple of TV shows and did stuff about other things as well.
So, when you started looking into MMR, when you looked into that Wakefield study, how did you proceed, and what did you discover?
Well, I did very routine journalistic work. Absolutely at the start, I put a phone call in to Dr. Wakefield. And immediately his publicist, Dr. Wakefield always works with professional publicists, and at this time his publicist, within about, I think, 3 hours of me calling, his publicist had made a complaint against me to the paper. Now, there was a bit of a strategic mistake on their part.
Yeah, I guess so.
Now, the essence of the mistake is I am actually self-employed,
right.
But I've worked for the Sunday Times since 1981. That is my home. I was a staff reporter, I was a specialist, they sent me to the United States, and so on and so on and so forth. But I am self-employed. But they imagined that this somehow meant that I was some sort of outsider. And when they got onto the paper and started making complaints against me, they were making complaints against somebody who'd actually sat at the next desk to the editor, and someone who'd worked with the head of the legal department since we were all young together. So it didn't work, their complaint.
Yeah, they knew you. They knew.
I was a known entity, and whilst I am regarded as being quite a difficult and mercurial person, I think it is true to say that I'm trusted, and they trusted me. And I think that was the first mistake that Wakefield's people made, was to make complaints against me. But the other thing I did right at the start was simply to ring up a couple of parents who'd been involved in the campaign against the vaccine and simply interviewed them. But interviewed them in a way that they had not been interviewed before. And that produced very important information right at the beginning, within hours, really, of beginning the story.
Which was,
I phoned a lady who had started a campaign group over MMR back in the early 1990s. And she told me in the conversation that members of her group were in the Wakefield study. And in fact, she slightly over-egged it. She said they were all members of our group and they're all still in the group. So she was saying that the research subjects, these parents who had turned up at this hospital and made this very specific allegation that their child had been normal and then had received the MMR, and within just days of vaccination was showing the first signs of autism, she told me that they were members of her campaign group. And immediately, obviously, alarm bells started to ring, because nothing about that was mentioned in the paper. They just appeared to be routine patients, part of the routine caseload of a big London hospital. And now we knew, at least from what she was saying, that somehow they were part of a group. And
a group that had been created before the study. It wouldn't be that interesting if they'd come together after the study.
That's
correct?
Right. It was a group that had been. It was the result of her campaigning. She put advertisements in newspapers and made approaches to a firm of lawyers. And it's a long-established technique that lawyers will try to get articles into media highlighting the subject of their concern, over which they wish to litigate, and getting their names as lawyers in the papers. That way, members of the public contact them, and that's how they increase their client list. So that was the picture that was beginning to emerge very, very quickly within, days, if not hours, of me beginning up this story.
And that was very useful to you because, of course, in the original study, the 12 parents were anonymous. They were not identified. You had originally, starting from scratch, you had no way of actually interviewing them, at least to begin with, because you had no way of knowing who they were.
That's right.
But all of a sudden, they fell into your lap.
I wouldn't say the individual families fell into my lap, but the principle that the people who we'd been seeing in media, because all the way through that period there were these families popping up in media saying, my child was vaccinated. They always had these wonderful Madonna and child photographs that would appear. Journalists love these kind of stories because they have human interest. Yep. They have, everything that you'd want as a journalist. And I began to realize that these people who were popping up in media were one and the same people as those who were in the study, which appeared to validate their claims.
And so how did you interviewed them? You said you interviewed them in a way that they hadn't been interviewed before. How did you interview them, and what did you discover?
Well, the key one was in the series of 12. The key family was family 2, which was the mother had been it came out over a period of time. The mother had been a long-time collaborator of Dr. Wakefield's. And I simply went to interview, and in fact, I used my middle name with editorial and legal approval from my managers. I used my middle name rather than my full name, so that they wouldn't Google me and see that I was an investigative reporter.
Oh, gosh.
They would just think I was. In fact, I said my name was Brian Lawrence, which is my middle name.
Uh-huh.
And I went to interview her.
And under what? Since you weren't representing yourself as an investigative journalist, how were you representing yourself?
Oh, from the Sunday Times, Brian Lawrence from the Sunday Times.
But not Brian Deere from the Sunday Times.
Not Brian Deere, because if I'd said I was Brian Deere, they would Google me. And I think anybody would. My friends say that I'm a journalist you wouldn't want to write about you. And I think if you were to Google me and you put Brian Deere into Google, you would see that I was the kind of person who you probably wouldn't want to give an interview to unless you were, quite sure of your position.
I hear he's difficult, mercurial, but trusted. So I like the man so far. So you got to number 2, and how did that interview go? What did you discover?
I went to interview her, and I gave her all the questions, asked her all the questions that people ever asked. Isn't it awful, and who do you blame, this kind of stuff. But I then went into exceptional detail as to what actually happened when she said her child was vaccinated and developed his problems. And I went over her story in very, very great detail. And she'd already recently gone through litigation and been involved in litigation. So the matter was very clear in her mind. And she told me a very detailed story, and I took her back to times and things. And you could say, well, people forget as the years go by. But this is the moment when she was saying that her child's life had forever been destroyed. So
hard
one
to
would have
that.
to expect that.
Yeah,
that this,
kind of remember that.
Yeah, she would have that in her mind. And I took her through it in very great detail, and it was quite clear that the story she was telling me did not correspond with any case in the Lancet paper, in Wakefield's paper. There simply wasn't one. And what it boiled down to in her case is that she had changed her story. She had told one story when she'd gone to see Wakefield and his people at the hospital. And now she was telling another story, and the two stories couldn't be reconciled.
And what the important difference was the length of time, I assume, that the symptoms...
The difference was when did the problems of autism first reveal themselves? And in her story that she told at the hospital, it was 14 days. She in fact set the 14-day limit. But actually, when one went to her actual story, one would see that was far from the case.
What was she saying in that time?
Well, in fact, it was months. We're talking months. So she'd moved it. She'd moved it back. Well, she'd given one story which suited the paper, and she may have done so in complete good faith. She may have misremembered or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But certainly, when she had the opportunity to study her child's records and be clear as to what the history actually was, it was a different story. So that was just one of the examples. Where
that was one. Yeah, so you could say, well, she forgot, and you could say a few months is still recently. It could still be a causal mechanism, right? That's still possible.
I can't think of why that would be the case. And because if one was to say that, then you could just about say anybody, because children are all vaccinated at about that age.
Yeah, well, but that alone didn't refute the study. So what else? What happened after that? That was early on, right?
That's right. Yes, and then over the course of time, I also spoke to other parents. I spoke to the father of a child from California. One of the 12 children, rather extraordinarily, had been flown 5,000 miles from Northern California to this London hospital and had been enrolled in this study. And I talked to him, and in fact he came over 1 year for Wimbledon, for the tennis in London, and I met him in a London hotel, and I showed him the Wakefield paper, and he just looked down it, and he said, "That's not true." So that's another case of the 12.
What was not true about that one? What was
at the time of onset, the symptoms that were supposed to have been associated with the onset. He also complained about, he'd done something very extraordinary. He'd had Wakefield's tests for measles. Wakefield was testing these children for measles virus. He'd actually got an extra sample of his child's biopsies, jumped into a taxi, driven across London to another laboratory and had them tested at another laboratory. And where Wakefield was saying there was measles virus, the other laboratory, which is actually a very, very prestigious international centre for virology, said there wasn't any. So that was another one of the family.
How did you find him?
Through diligent journalism.
Okay. So you started to raise, in your mind, you started to realize, this study there seems to be some problems with it. How did it develop into a scandal?
Well,
where was the next piece of evidence that made you realize that this wasn't just carelessness or a bad interview or somebody who just tried to their best to remember and whatever?
Well, at an early stage, in February 2004 firstly, and then in November 2004, I published, first in the Sunday Times, very big piece revealing for the first time that Wakefield had been employed to do this research by a firm of lawyers. And secondly, that the children recruited into the study had in some sense been marshalled and gathered together. Some of them had been solicited, they'd been brought to the hospital. So the fact the study had been contrived for lawyers to be used in litigation, we published in February 2004. Then later that year, I did a television program, an hour-long primetime television program on the UK's Channel 4 network, which is a nationwide sort of semi-public service network, where we revealed that Wakefield had taken out a patent for his own single measles vaccine, and just before he'd announced to the world that they should boycott this triple vaccine and take up vaccinating their children with single vaccines, that we'd established that he'd taken out a patent on a single measles vaccine, and that the tests that were being carried out in his own laboratory had shown there was no measles virus in any of these children. So that was 2004, and a result of that, Wakefield made his second big mistake. You might remember his first big mistake was to have complaints made against me to my employers. His second big mistake was to begin litigation. He sued for libel.
After this 2004 feature piece.
Yes, he and the television program.
What evidence did you have that he had taken money from lawyers in advance of the study?
Oh, well, we didn't have it all.
That's a very dramatic, that's an enormously damaging claim.
Well, we only had a little bit of it then. The one thing he could never have expected, I suppose you could say this is his third mistake, or maybe this is his second mistake, and suing me was the third. What he could never have expected, no one would ever have expected in late 1996, early 1997, it's a long time ago now, going back to when Princess Diana was still alive, long time ago, no one could have expected that an incoming Labour government, the Blair government, the government of Tony Blair, came in with a commitment to introduce a Freedom of Information Act. America's had a Freedom of Information Act for so long, people are probably got no idea when it ever began. We had one that was introduced by the incoming Blair government, and it started to take effect in 2000. It was enacted in 2000. It started to take effect, strictly speaking, in 2004. And because the government had told public bodies to act as if the act was in force, I was able to get from public bodies the fact that Wakefield had been paid. The funding authority, it's called in Britain it's called the Legal Aid Fund. It's kind of like the public defender system, except that the government doesn't provide the defenders, it provides the money. And so it was a government fund to allow poorer people access to litigation, which had funded Wakefield through this lawyer, and I was able to get that information. So he could never have expected, when he was doing this research, that all of a sudden his funding would be exposed to scrutiny, and also the ethics committee. It's in America they're called institutional review boards. They're bodies of doctors and scientists and other people associated with medical centres which give permission for research to take place. The paperwork of that body at the Royal Free Hospital also was moved into the public domain by the Freedom of Information Act, and I think I was the first person ever to get hold of these kind of papers, and I got those. So
what did those tell you?
Well, those told us that the work that had gone on, the battery of investigations that had gone on at the hospital, ileocolonoscopies, lumbar punctures, MRI scans, radioactive drinks, EEGs, also did not have ethical approval. There clearly was a mismatch between the documents that had been generated by the Institutional Review Board and the work that had been done, which in itself gave probable cause to investigate further. The public wasn't massively interested, never been massively interested in ethical issues, although I think they should be, but it gave probable cause to investigate further. So the Freedom of Information Act coming in was a major breakthrough that helped to puncture the anonymity around this particular piece of research.
So he sues you in 2004 after the TV show and after the newspaper piece, arguing that you had basically accused him of cooking up a study for profit.
Yeah,
ugly. Yeah. It is rather unattractive. Were you a little bit scared?
Well, there were a couple of occasions.
I'd be a little bit scared.
Well, the lawsuit began in the beginning of 2005. And he immediately applied to the court to have it frozen so that he could go around telling people that he was suing, but not actually sue, because litigation, particularly in the UK, is immensely expensive.
Don't losers pay also?
That's right, losers pay everything. But he was being insured by the medical establishment. The bodies who insure doctors were funding him. But we went to court, myself, Channel 4, the television company, went to court and got a court order compelling him to continue suing. He had to put up or shut up. So he then, with financial backing from all British doctors, in fact, continued to sue. And in the course of this litigation, which went on for 2 years, well, from a personal level, you were saying, well, this might be quite scary. I mean, there were occasions, because he also sued me with regard to my website, for which I have unlimited liability, and which I would have lost my home if my stories hadn't been true. I would be sitting at my computer doing some work, and there would be a ring on the doorbell, and there'd be a man dressed in black leather with a motorcycle helmet on, standing outside, and he would present me with an envelope. And this happened to me twice. He presented me with an envelope. I opened the envelope, and there's an estimate for Wakefield's legal costs for the hearing that was going to take place the next day in the High Court. And they were the figures, I suppose, you'd be talking about $30,000 US, that kind of money, just for one hearing. So that was the kind of pressure that they were trying to put on me. But then the next stage, which was really very, very unfortunate for him, I think, is that we got a court order against him requiring him to hand over to our lawyers, I never physically took possession of them, the hospital medical records of the children. There was an application in the High Court, and the judge balanced the issues of the confidentiality of the children as opposed to the fairness of the litigation that was in front of the court. And the judge ordered that I be allowed to read the unredacted, with their names and all their details, medical records of the 12 children, which is, well, in fact, it was just 11 of them at the time. The American wasn't involved in this. The American case wasn't involved in this. So under strict supervision of my lawyers, with a lawyer sitting at the end of the table throughout, I sat in a lawyer's office and read the medical records of the children.
Make your hair stand on end?
Excuse me?
Did it make your hair stand on end?
Well, I cannot even say that. I'm saying, and have never said anything about why I read in those medical records. The position is that they were disclosed to me in the course of litigation, and I may make no use of anything that I saw in those records or disclose anything of that nature, because as I was sitting there reading them, Dr. Wakefield's lawyers were in a taxi travelling across London to the High Court to disband the lawsuit against me. And in fact, when I got home that night, and I hadn't taken any notes with me or a document or anything at all, I went home, got home, phone rang, and it was my lawyer saying, it's over. They've thrown in the towel. So I'm in a position where I've read the medical records of these 11 of these 12 children, but can make no use of the content of them. However, I have to say, I've talked to my lawyers about this, it is a fact that it's impossible to unknow something. Once you know something, you can't stop knowing it. That would be unrealistic.
Right.
So what I did was to ensure that I presented myself at the next opportunity where these medical records would, if you like, go on display. And those medical records would go on display at a disciplinary hearing which arose from my original stories. The British General Medical Council, which is the body representing, it's like the regulator for all British doctors, like a medical board, but it's the whole of the United Kingdom, initiated disciplinary proceedings against Dr. Wakefield as a result of my initial stories. And between July 2007 and May 2010, they had a public hearing which lasted for 217 days, where, among other things, but mostly, these medical records were read into the transcript, into the public domain, over and over and over. So I was able to be present throughout those proceedings, and the picture began to build up that these, the stories, the true stories of these children could not be reconciled with what was published in the Lancet. There's simply, the mismatch was so enormous that you would begin to wonder whether you were talking about the same children. And that information, which was laid out in public by, we call them Queen's Counsel, their senior trial attorneys. There were 5 of them, plus all their junior lawyers and all their supporting lawyers, and a disciplinary panel of 5, 3 of whom were doctors, would go through these records over and over and over, looking at precisely what was wrong with these children, what dates did they have their vaccinations, when did their developmental problems come on, did they have inflammatory bowel disease. And I was able to sit there as a reporter and, if you like, scoop up all that information and ultimately to present it to the public.
So, question, when using, was it the Freedom of Information Act to get those unredacted records as part of the legal case, when the High Court ruled that you were allowed to see those, so you're looking at them with the with the lawyers, making sure you're not stuffing them in your socks or elsewhere. And the lawyers for Andrew Wakefield are racing across town to try to kill the lawsuit so that you won't be able to see them, presumably.
What their motive was, we'll never know, but
right.
It was an uncanny coincidence.
Yeah. That raises the question, why did Wakefield produce those records?
Well, he had no choice.
Why didn't he destroy them? Because they were very damning, evidently.
Well, you see,
or why did he say they were lost? I can't find that. That was 8 years ago, 6 years ago. That was whatever.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you. Because the disciplinary hearing, which the General Medical Council had brought, was already in play. They'd already started doing the work for that. So his lawyers were in possession of these documents. They didn't have to go to him to get them.
I understand.
They'd already got them for the General Medical Council proceedings and were in their offices. And your listeners may find this hard to believe, but lawyers do work normally, and we hope mostly, to an ethical code. Well,
if you get caught destroying evidence, you lose your career forever.
Yeah.
It's awkward.
So they turned over to us. I think he was very surprised. I don't think he quite realized that they would have to turn over those to us. And indeed, they turned over many, many documents, extraordinarily incriminating documents that would again be read into the record of the General Medical Council. So we learned, for example, that he'd been paid, that he'd been contracted by the lawyer for 2 years before the paper was published at a rate of £150 an hour, which was a lot of money then. It is much more now. And ultimately he accumulated the figure in British pounds was £435,643 plus his expenses, which at the prevailing exchange rate we reckon was about $750,000 US. He was actually paid by the lawyers. So that information came over to us as well. But again, it wasn't information that we could immediately use.
So we have a disciplinary hearing, and he loses, right?
That's right.
So what happens to him?
Well, in January of last year, he was found guilty of a raft of the most extraordinary charges. There were 4 counts of dishonesty. One was dishonesty in his research fraud on aspects of the way the children had been recruited for the study. There was a finding of dishonesty in the financial aspects of the study, if you like, financial fraud. Then there were 2 counts of common lying, dishonesty, lying to other doctors who'd asked him, because, when people first saw this paper, other doctors asked him, well, where did you get the money for this? And he lied about that. And another doctor actually had a big a panel where a whole group of professors and experts and things had been convened in London to discuss his research. One of the specialists there said, well, essentially, where did you get the children? And he lied about that. So he was found guilty on 4 counts of dishonesty. Then about a dozen counts of, if you like, causing children to undergo this extraordinary battery of invasive and actually quite hazardous tests for no clinical reason and without any kind of ethical approval. And then he was found guilty on ordering children to have lumbar punctures without any qualifications, because he's not a pediatrician and he had no relevant background in clinical care. In fact, his contract said he was not allowed to involve himself in the care of patients. So this great raft of charges was found against him in January. And then in May of last year, he was ordered to be what we call struck off, which is to lose his license to practice medicine. And that was in May. And then on December 21st, just last month, the final stage occurred when it was found that he was not appealing the decision, because doctors, being as they are in the UK, if you're struck off, if you lose your license, you're entitled to appeal to the High Court. And he went round telling all his supporters that he was appealing to the High Court. This is all outrageous. He never did any of these things. The General Medical Council are working for the drug industry. I'm working for the drug industry. It's all an evil conspiracy against him, and he was appealing. But on December 21st, the General Medical Council recorded that he had not pursued his appeal, and his what we call erasure. I actually rather like the word, actually. He was erased from the medical record, medical register, and he is no longer a medical doctor, and I don't think he ever will be again.
I think not, although I like both those phrases. I like erasure and I like struck off. I think that has a nice ring to it.
Finality, yeah.
There are two, a few questions now. In economics, particularly on this program, we like to talk about the seen and the unseen. So the seen are those poor 12 kids who get punctured and poked and all those things. But, of course, the unseen are all the children who either didn't get MMR or their parents who had anxiety about their vaccine. What was the impact of the study on vaccination rates? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, that's the one that people focus on. UK vaccination rates fell from 92%. In fact, they started to fall just slightly before this paper, because Wakefield was going around telling everybody and appearing in television programs saying that the MMR caused inflammatory bowel disease. He subsequently went on to abandon that. But anyway, he was saying that. And then this paper appeared, and the vaccination rates fell from 92% of children at age 2 had received the vaccine down to 80%. And that was sufficient to, generally it's felt that pretty much 9 out of 10 children have to be vaccinated to stop measles returning to the population and starting to spread in the population. So it fell well below the rate necessary to keep measles at bay. And there were the beginnings of sporadic outbreaks of measles. In fact, measles was declared to be endemic again in the UK as a result of this. A couple of children died, which in the great scheme of things is not a lot of dead children when you think that I think still 300,000 children die of measles around the world. So, the fact that 2 of them were British is perhaps not necessarily a headline, except in Britain. But people talk about infectious disease, but I think there's another group of people who were and continue to be horrendously victimized as a result of this vaccine scare. And these are the parents who believe that their child is autistic because they had them vaccinated.
Right, and have guilt and can't, it's horrifying.
Now, that group of parents, my heart goes out to them that they've been told this story, because when I've come across this a lot over the years in journalism, and I can't speak from first-hand experience. I can only speak from repeated telling to me by parents. When people have a child and it's the most precious thing in their life and something that is so life transforming and central to their thoughts and their feelings, and the parents then perhaps find that they think, well, perhaps their child can't hear them when they're calling them, or the child perhaps starts looking at their fingers all the time, or recoils from being touched, or starts to behave in an unusual way. Parents go on what I call the desperate quest. They go to their pediatrician, and then they go to specialists, and they go here, and they're trying to find out what's wrong. And initially, the pediatricians are very reluctant to say, "Oh, well, your child might have autism." The response normally is, "Well, we just have to see children develop at a different rate," and so they reassure. But when those reassurances are not borne out in fact, you find quite often parents become angry towards their pediatricians. They become suspicious, and they start to think, well, what's to blame for this? What can I do? What's to blame? And then along comes Dr. Wakefield with his, it was the vaccine, it was the drug companies, you've been subjected to some sort of conspiracy by government agencies, because it's all part of the thing is that the Centers for Disease Control are in on it, and the drug companies are behind it, and they knowingly. Dr. Wakefield, in fact, attended a Washington rally in D.C. where he actually said not only that the MMR was causing autism, but that doctors, public health doctors involved in government and elsewhere, knew that the vaccine was causing autism and were covering it up. A most extraordinary allegation to make against members of the medical profession, which has been borne out by nothing in terms of evidence. No whistleblower has ever come forward. Nobody has ever produced any evidence other than doctors throughout the world confronted with autism and confronted with allegations that perhaps environmental agents such as vaccines could be responsible, have done anything but their best to try to get to the bottom of these things. So he has gone to these parents and told them that they have been victims of a wicked conspiracy which has injured their child. And that makes some of these parents very angry, some of them very guilty, some of them very hurt, and all of them absolutely bewildered as to how they can find a way out. I mean, the good news perhaps is that sometimes children who first show signs of autism and other developmental problems actually improve and go on to live perfectly satisfactory, self-contained lives. But unfortunately, some don't. Right. And the parents of those children, I think, are desperately vulnerable, and I think have been desperately preyed on by this man's false research.
So the law firm that paid him the roughly $750,000 in the 2 years in advance of the study, what happened to them? Did they sue some people for this? They did start a lawsuit, but then after about 18 million British pounds, which, what would that be? I don't know. A lot of money.
Yeah, $45 million or something. After they'd shared out that among their experts, such as Dr. Wakefield and people he recruited, and among themselves as lawyers, they got a lawsuit up, and then the lawyers said, well, actually, we can't make a case that the MMR vaccine causes autism. They abandoned the lawsuit and all went off into the distance. The lawsuit, though, then was then exported across the Atlantic, and then there was a lawsuit heard in the Federal Vaccine Court in 2000, when was it? 2007, I think the hearing was. And that again found no evidence that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And that went to the U.S. Court of Appeals just last year. And that found, in fact, I can tell you the date it went to the appeals because it's on my website right in front of me. August of last year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit upheld the rulings that the MMR vaccine does not cause autism or bowel disease.
So despite this investment, the law firm that created this scandal, they just lost a lot of money?
No, they made a lot of money.
How?
Well, because the government's legal aid fund, in the UK, the government's legal aid fund picked up the tab. They gave them 18 million British pounds to develop this case, to employ lawyers, to employ experts like Wakefield and other doctors. So that's how they did it. Then the United States, in the federal vaccine court system, even if the claims fail, the attorneys bringing the case get paid. So in both systems, in both Britain and America, you've got government systems which pay lawyers to bring cases alleging vaccine injury.
So they didn't need it to be a great study. They just needed to be good enough to get the thing started.
Having the next bit of money.
And having a study in the Lancet, that'll do.
Well, in fact, at a very early stage, I talked to the people behind the legal funding, and they made it very clear that as far as they were concerned, that the internal advice they were getting from Wakefield was the same as what the paper was saying. So what Wakefield was able to do was to get 12 other doctors to sign up to the proposition that there was, I think, what was the expression he used, apparent precipitating event, that the apparent precipitating event, and precipitating means cause, that the apparent causal event behind these children's autism was the MMR vaccine, and that caused a great tranche of money to be released to the lawyers and to Dr. Wakefield.
And how does The Lancet responded to this slightly embarrassing publication?
Well, that was, in fact, the final piece of my series in the BMJ was on that very subject. I told the Lancet about all this. Well, I mean, I didn't have all of it because there are large pieces of the picture which I didn't have, and I certainly didn't have the clear evidence of fabrication which we have now. But I raised this all with the editor of the Lancet back in February 2004, and within 48 hours they denied it all, issued statements, and hoped it would all go away.
Oh, it's too bad, isn't it? Now they look a little silly. It's a bit awkward for them. We talk a lot on this program about science and the challenges of verifying science, overcoming our biases, the role of self-deception, confirmation bias, which is very present in economics, and of course it's present in all endeavors of human existence. But a story like this, I salute you, sir. It's an extraordinary achievement. But it's also deeply depressing. It's depressing because you could have said when it first came out it was junk science, a study based on 12 sample points, again, without much understanding of how they were generated. It makes you wonder, and of course people have looked into this, that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Now, not all studies are corrupt, as this one turned out to be, but many are fraudulent. And where does this leave us with our understanding of medicine, epidemiology? What is what's your assessment of the field, having gotten into the kitchen, as it were?
Well, you see, most people in this subject have seen it in terms of vaccines, have seen it in terms of measles and infectious disease and autism and things like that. From the start, I've always seen it as being an issue of the integrity of science. I always saw it as being whether this paper was true or not, and how he could get away with what he got away with. And I think it is a depressing picture because it took something, I think the final figures were, it's been in the region of like $10 million it has taken to crack a case series of 12 patients. That's money in the General Medical Council hearing, in the litigation involving Wakefield, in journalistic fees, television production costs, and all the stuff that's gone on around this. It's cost about $10 million to get to the bottom of this little case series of 12 patients. And, you know, the great bulk of science is not that interesting to the general public, and therefore would not create the probable cause for a newspaper reporter to be funded by a newspaper and a television station to go after this for such a long period of time and get all this investigative work done with, you know, government regulators and what have you. So you really would have to wonder what else is going on in the laboratories and medical centres. And the fact that Wakefield thought he was going to get away with it, and the kind of casual way that he went about it, leads me to think that he was working within a culture within which that wasn't far from unusual. What he was doing wasn't wasn't far from extraordinary. The kind of alterations and misrepresentations he made were far from remarkable. By common standards, I suspect.
Well, part of it's the nature of human beings, as I mentioned, and part of it's the elusiveness of truth. Part of it is the nature of the publication process and the culture of science, as you mentioned. When I was Googling around trying to get background for our conversation, I came across a recently published study that showed a relationship between autism and living near a highway, a major highway. If you lived within a certain number of feet of a major highway, you had I think a 10% higher chance of getting autism. The authors were at least honest enough to report that their results didn't hold up if you live near a busy city street. So here's an awkward thing. They find a correlation, and they're happy to opine on the source of the correlation. They say, and the causation. They say, well, there must be some chemicals in gasoline and pollution and cars that cause autism. Well, it could be, of course, could be. But it's awkward for their theory that in their own results, they don't find a correlation with major city street near living near those. So the authors explain, well, there must be different chemicals near those streets. Well, that would be one hypothesis to explain the finding. The other would be that their initial theory is wrong, that there's no relationship, and it's just a statistical anomaly which is going to crop up, as we know, a few percent each time. And in a large enough sample, you do enough fishing, you're going to find correlations that are not causal. And so this, I refer our listeners back to the podcast that we did with Ed Lemer, which highlights the problems of these issues in economics, but it's clear that these kind of problems are widespread in other parts of research.
Yes, there's so much Texas sharpshooting around of people just taking a shot at a barn door and then painting the bullseye around the hole.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to get clear evidence of very much in that field of autism, because if there are environmental factors at work, there could be so many, or I don't know how many years it would ever take to test the hypothesis for each one that we've got now.
And the simplest hypothesis is that we've gotten better at detecting it, and that's the source of and we're aware of it, and that's the source of the increase in its prevalence. But there could be other genuine underlying factors, of course. My lesson, what I try to teach my children, is to be skeptical of scientific findings. But it's hard for us, as you say. A lot of us, we're vulnerable, and we like good stories, and we like to be scared, and it's nice to come.
We'd like to think the scientists have the answer, because, I mean, from an ordinary person in the street, you think, well, if scientists don't have the answer, well, what's the point of them? That's right. What we have them for. And to discover that scientists actually don't have the answers, but are all sort of just putting forward various ideas for testing, and maybe eventually one or two of them will prove to be correct, is kind of a bit of a dispiriting view of the nature of science.
And we have a lot of romance about it. We talked recently with Bruce Caldwell about Hayek, and Hayek was very wary of what he called scientism, and scientism is the use of the language and tools of science to create a scientific impression that's not scientific. And again, this would be a prime case. What are you going to turn to next? Are you stuck being a vaccination man for the
absolutely
foreseeable
out of
future?
This, I hope. I absolutely hope that talking to you will be amongst the last things I ever have to be involved in terms of vaccines. And I'm not sure I really want to spend a great deal more time on long investigations, because you end up I don't know, there's a saying of the Buddha that the things that we dwell on become the shape of our minds. And I'm kind of tired of the hunt aspect of it, and the adversarial quality to investigative journalism, the extraordinary hours that have to be put into it to get anywhere, the complex legal issues that are always coming up. So, I mean, in an ideal world, I would find something that didn't require me to do more than write, maybe a couple of 100 words in a piece, and be cheap and cheerful and about it all. But I have a feeling that that's just the way I'm feeling at the moment, and it won't be long before something else comes along that I get interested in and get drawn off into.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's because I think probably what I need now is a holiday.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, and thousands, if not millions of others, are grateful for all those hours you put in.
Thank you.
Striking a blow against fraud in this kind of situation is it doesn't make up for all the pain and the losses that people suffered as a result of the fraud, but it is it'll open people's eyes down the road to lots of other things, I hope.
Oh, thank you. Let's hope.
My guest today has been Brian Deer. Brian, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Well, thanks, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.